Shalom. This is Rabbi Sachs coming to you from the Chai Center, and welcome to the Chai Academy. Chai Academy is a plethora of classes that we give online on various topics that are usually given live, but are recorded and can be found at thechaicenter.com/academy or YouTube channel, The Chai Academy. So we have been, for the past couple of weeks, we've been discussing modern day Israel and some fascinating history, and we've also been discussing I think there were miracles abound in the 1948 war, incredible miracles, 67 incredible miracles, and 73 wasn't too shabby either. So the Yom Kippur War, that's where we lost the most soldiers, right? The casualties were high, but Egypt lost a lot more. After the Yom Kippur War, Egypt resigned themselves to the fact that they cannot beat Israel, and therefore there was a peace agreement made. Now, before we get to the UN, just a couple of things about what the politics are after the 67 war. So when Israel, in the 67 war, when Israel beat Egypt and got the Sinai, they beat Syria and got the Golan, and they beat Jordan and got back Judea and Samaria. Let's talk about Egypt first. So they got the Sinai Desert, which was 3 times greater than what they had in Israel. However, there wasn't that much going on. It was a desert, and that really wasn't the major coup. Eventually they gave back the Sinai Desert, and there was a couple of settlements there, but not much. The Golan, they'll never give back because of security. The Golan is on top of the mountains looking down. Now, let's talk about the West Bank. The reason why it's called the West Bank is because it's the west of the Jordan River. So until 48, the West Bank of the Jordan River, which includes Jerusalem, which includes the old city of Jerusalem where the Holy Temple is. It includes Hebron where the cave of the patriarchs are, etc. So until then, there was kind of no issue. Jews lived here, Jews lived there, etc. But once 48 happened, right, so from 48 to 67, once again, Jews were kicked out of the lands, and they could not live in those areas in the West Bank of the west of the Jordan River. Once 67 happened and Israel conquered it, right, they had a problem because they had 1 million Arabs lived in the west of the Jordan River. Some call it West Bank, and some call it Judea and Samaria. So so you have 1 million Arabs who have no desire to live under Israeli rule, right? So, by the way, those that call it the West Bank are usually those that say, okay, Israel should give it back, and so West Bank really belongs to Jordan and the Palestinians, etc. Those who call it Judea and Samaria, someone like myself, we're very, it's to us, Judea and Samaria is where our main history was. Judea and Samaria is our biblical history. Safed came later. Right? But our biblical history, a lot of it happened in Judea and Samaria. Right? So here you have a problem. What do you do with 1 million Arabs who don't want to be under Israeli rule? If you annex it, then you've increased your Arab population by 30%. So you increase it by 30%, it leads to a couple of problems, right? One is that the Arabs, their birth rate is pretty high, and eventually, um, and eventually they'll outpopulate the Jews, and it will become an Arab country and not a Jewish country. If you don't annex it, then you're ruling you're ruling over those that don't want you to be ruling. If you annex it, then they have a right and vote, etc., etc. Now, some people say, okay, let's annex it, but don't give them the right to vote. So that creates a problem in itself, because that is an apartheid state, right? Where you have citizens that are not allowed to vote. So the what do you do? What do you do? There are Israeli Arabs, right, who do vote because they're part of Israel. But if they Israel, if they annex it, they're damned if they do, damned if they don't, right? So so what do you do? What do you do? And that's been the conundrum. That has been the conundrum of Israel. That's been the issue, is what do they do with them? If they annex it, they're going to lose the unique quality of having a Jewish Israel. If they don't annex it, do you want to actually rule them? Now, they're around that time, right, around the 67, 68, there was a group called Gush Emunim, which means the block of believers. And what they did is they started to build settlements and places for Jews to live in Judea and Samaria, because they said Judea and Samaria is our deal. It belongs to Israel. And they set up, and the person who spearheaded it was Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook, and he was the son of the first chief rabbi of Israel. Right? And he was firebrand, and so they started to set up. It led to many settlements, which was a good thing, but it also led to some type of underground terrorism. And the underground Jewish terrorism was to kill any Arabs, to take revenge on any Arabs that killed Jews or wounded Jews. And that was the goal. It went awry because at some point they were, going to blow up a bus of innocent civilians, and that's not the Jewish way. But because of them, we have huge settlements today. Which is settlements is I don't mean it derogatory. Some people refer to settlers as derogatory, but we have communities. We have Efrat. We have in Hebron, we have in Kiryat Arba, and this is all to those pioneers who said we have to live in Judea and Samaria, because if we don't, we're going to lose it. We're going to lose it. All this really became kind of mute. It became a moot point, because in the 90s they were given, the Palestinians or the Arabs were given a right to self-govern. So therefore you have Palestinian authority and right to govern in certain areas, and you have Jewish areas. This all takes place in the West Bank, all takes place in Judea and Samaria, and so annex it becomes a little bit more difficult. You can't even annex it because you have these areas that have a right to self-govern. So that just sort of explains the conflict and the conundrums and the issues. Now, we're now going to go to the UN. So the UN, obviously not a friend of Israel. They started off, I think, with good intentions, but as time went along, as we'll explain, until it led to UN Resolution 3379, that Zionism is racism. So the reason why the UN is so hostile to Israel, and basically it's been already 50 years since they're hostile to Israel, is because, think about it, there's 20 Arab states. Now, granted, things are shifting, and some of these Arab states feel closer to Israel than they do to the Palestinian cause, because they've been led along for so long. And the Palestinians are still in refugee camps, even with all the money given. So they're beginning to lose patience, like Saudi Arabia is beginning to lose patience, or Bahrain and etc. Dubai, the Emirates, in other words. So, but the UN basically, the makeup until recently, and we'll see what happens, but there have been 20 Arab states all vote against Israel, right? Then on top of that, you had the Soviet Union and all their affiliates voted against Israel, right? Communism voted against Israel, and you had dictators, third world dictators. So you have this basically, you have this lockstep. You have this block of voters, and it's not just Israel, right? They don't, they target Israel, but it's not only Israel. So they voted, and they voted this 3379 that Zionism is racism, and which was a terrible thing, because it was sort of it came from the UN that Zionism is racism. Now I will tell you, this took place in the 70s, right? But just to give you an idea how nutty the UN is, and why I have no respect for the UN whatsoever, and would love for the UN to be turned into condominiums, and I would like to buy one if I can on the East River. Beautiful. But to give you an idea, in 1975, so they had the International Women's Conference, right, and that took place, and right to boost women's to remove sexism from the countries. That was the idea. International Women's Conference. The final resolution of that conference, of an International Women's Conference, was it denounced Israel, and not sexism. It was an International Women's Conference to denounce sexism, but their final resolution was Israel is Zionist, Zionist is racism, right? And they didn't talk about sexism in their final resolution for the obvious reason. Arab countries are sexist, right? The Arabs are sexist. Women are second-class citizens, and they don't have a right to vote in many of these Arab countries. It's only the head of household, the man. Whereas Israel, a woman is a citizen, Israeli citizen, just like a man is, and so that's just to show you the nuttiness. They couldn't. This lockstep blocked them from drafting a resolution on sexism, and instead they drafted a resolution. They drafted a resolution on Israel. So this took place in 1975. I think it was in November 1975, which is the same year as the International Women Conference, and it passed 72 to 35, and there were, I looked it up, there were 32 abstentions. Now, this took place at a General Assembly. Generally speaking, a General Assembly is not binding. Right? It's something that takes place in the General Assembly, as opposed to the various committees they have. But it was symbolic. It was very, very symbolic and very hurtful. Basically, it's saying to the Jews, you don't really have a right to your homeland because it's racist. And it created all types of problems. Now, Moynihan, who was the UN ambassador from the United States to the UN, his comment was that this is obscene. Right? Chaim Herzog, who was the president of Israel, he said Hitler would feel comfortable in the UN. That was his response. Now, it gave anti-Semites fodder. It gave them a platform, and which happens today. The Linda Sarsours of the world, and these rallies for Black Lives Matter, became an anti-Semitic rally, because it's the cancel culture, right? So what happened was they said, oh, the blacks are oppressed, the Zionists, they oppress the Arabs, so they join together. Zionism is racism. Zionism beats down on the unfortunate Arabs, right? The Black Lives Matter. The cops beat down, so they join the two, and in fact, in the United Kingdom, right after that happened, the UN passed their 3379, is that the academia, which led eventually to academia in the United States, they said, okay, we have to close all Jewish clubs, all Jewish culture clubs, because ultimately Zionism is racism. And then academia, it came to academia until today. The students in Israel, the culture clubs on American universities go through such a difficult time. And they ban, Sabra hummus on campus, and they ban this, that, and the other because Zionism is racism. Now, if you actually have an honest anti-Semite, and you meet them and discuss with them, right? You can say, how can you possibly explain Israel being, which is Zionist, is racism, right? When you have so many different races living in Israel. If Israel was a racist country, you could only have, certain races, but Israel allows all races to live and to vote, right? And in fact, Israel, they brought in blacks from Ethiopia who were being targeted by true racists. And once again, women can vote, Jews can vote, non-Jews can vote. If you become a citizen of Israel, it's completely not racist. It's a democracy, and it's the only democracy true democracy in the Middle East, and it's the only true ally of the United States in the Middle East. So if you really get an anti-Semite with a little bit of conscience, he or she couldn't defend this Zionism is racism comment, right? But they're not honest, and therefore they're also ignorant, and therefore Zionism is racism. Now, if you have somebody tell you that Zionism is racism today, not only are they an anti-Semite, they're also extremely ignorant anti-Semite. And the reason being is, in 1991, it was revoked. So in 1975, they voted on it. In 1991, it was actually revoked. That Zionism is not racism. So to these that say Zionism is racism, look at the UN, they have selective amnesia because it was revoked. The same UN revoked it. And but the UN has been hostile to Israel ever since then, and they have an automatic vote. China and anybody that beats up on people will vote for them because it takes the focus on China, right? What China is doing now is completely racism, the way that China is treating the Muslim countries. But the focus is on Israel. If you focus on Israel and you beat up Israel, and truth be told, any American politician that says, let the UN decide, is also ignorant. There was a senator, right, George McGovern. I think he was running for something or other, maybe even the presidency. And he had a wealthy Jewish supporters, and he invited them for a meeting at his offices. And they came and they asked him, "What is your opinion about the UN? What is your opinion about the Jews in Israel, Middle East, the problems that take place? What is your problem?" So he said, "I think we're going to let the UN decide." Now, at that meeting, you had wealthy donors who lambasted him and said, that wasn't the correct answer. That was the wrong answer. The minute you let the UN decide, it's going to be doomsday for Israel. So the UN is biased. The UN has once again this lockstep and they vote in blocks, and so the UN is actually not something, it's there, and Israel participates in it, but it's not something that is really serious or credible. They like to think they're credible, but they're really not. And we've explained it before that you can go through a year of the UN, and you could have 130 UN sanctions or UN resolutions against Israel, and have one against Syria that gas their own people. So it is, or none against, the latest one in Burma, right? There probably is going to be no UN resolution, but meanwhile there was a military coup. So the UN is just not a serious outfit, and as far as Jews are concerned, is that we can live quite well without the UN. The UN, WRA, right? The UNRWA, as to give you an example, right? They oversee the refugee camps in Palestine, right? There shouldn't be refugee camps. There's no reason for it, right? It's 75 years later. Billions of dollars have gone through Arafat's hands and Abbas's hands and Hamas's hands, and there's still refugee camps. That doesn't make sense. It's not Israel's problem, right? It's not. If you would say this is 2 years after 67, I get it, because there was a lot of shuffling and people moving, people running, right? So I get it. But in 2021, 2020, 2000, 1983, there should be no. And the only refugee camp in the world that lasts 75 years is Palestine. The only organization that has UNRWA overseeing the refugee camps is in Palestine, and it should not be. There was so much money given, right, that they don't have to have refugee camps, right? They could be living, the amount of money per person given to the Palestinians, each Palestinian should be able to have a brick and mortar house together with a swimming pool than live in a refugee camp. And the reason they're still in refugee camps is because it's a money maker. That's the only reason they're still in refugee camps, is because it brings in incredible amounts of money. There was a reason the previous administration stopped giving them money, right? Because where's it all going? And it's a mistake of the current administration to start giving them money without really proper oversight. So UNRWA really should be dismantled. There should be no refugee camps, and they should start living. The fact that you've kept families, that you've kept them, you've imprisoned families in the refugee camps is unconscionable, and it has nothing to do with Israel. Nothing. So it is so the fact that the UN is corrupt, the UN is biased, is no surprise, and it's been that way for a long time. And the 20 Arab states, they do a lot of business with many countries, and especially the countries that are really, third world and dictators. Of course, they're going to vote against Israel. Israel is the moral conscience of the world, that you can be in the Middle East and still have a democracy. So UN 3379, while hurtful, wasn't binding, and it was anti-Semitism at its finest, or at its worst. So don't let it bother you, because it's been rescinded, and it's been revoked. But just so you know, that if the UN makes a vote, a resolution against Israel like they do every year, it's really pathetic. Don't give money to UNRWA. Just don't give money. they're not worth it. They're not worth the paper they're written on. Signing off. God bless.